Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes on Everything Cooperative. Welcome this morning. You know, the National Cooperative Business Association they're celebrating 100 years working on cooperatives, being the main spokesman for all of the different forms of cooperatives. And this morning, we have Ms. Freeborn on the line from the credit union sector of the cooperatives. Good morning, Teresa. I'm glad to have you on this morning. Glad you're able to come on. And this particular month, NCBA is celebrating Women's History Month, and we're glad you're on to celebrate that with us today. How did you get involved in co-ops?
Well, I go way back to my first years with a financial cooperative, as in a credit union, was back in Canada, which is kind of considered the hotbed of the credit union industry in Vancouver, British Columbia. And we had a local credit union that my parents belonged to because, of course, they couldn't get credit from the traditional financial institutions at that time. And they got to know the credit union quite well. And let's just put it this way. My mother arranged my first job. So I got to go work at the credit union and then, of course, went to school from there. But that was my introduction at a very, very young age.
So you went to the credit unions first. I really wish I had known about credit unions at that early age of my career. I didn't learn about them until about 20 years ago. Celebrating Women's History Month, what's the significance of Women's History Month?
I would say that, I know it's called Women's History Month, but it's really about the girls, and that is the women of tomorrow, and opening up their worlds and helping them to live their lives without the absurd limits that many of us have struggled with as we grew up. And, when we talk about women's lives and women's achievements and the way women have used whatever power they had to break down the barriers and enact change, it's girls and boys, by the way, learn that women can be extraordinary leaders. So I think that's the significance to me.
NCBA, like I said, NCBA CLUSA, celebrating 100 years. And going back to 1916, wonder what it was like. Women's suffrage in the United States back then, it seemed like it would have been, we think about it now as unequal pay, glass ceilings. But what do you think it was like in 1916? I think the National Women's Party was formed in 1916 also. It's a militant group.
Exactly. And I think it sort of reminds me of the history of credit unions as well, because if you go back to those early years and think about why credit unions were formed, they were really formed to address the issues of that time. And although credit unions can go way back, and we have history in Germany in the mid-1800s, the first ones actually depended on the charity of very wealthy men for support, which is a bit ironic. But in 1900, credit unions got a foothold in North America, and that was through a Canadian, actually, named Alphonse Desjardins. And he organized a credit union in Quebec. But the reasons were the same to organize those credit unions back then as it was in Germany 50 years previous to that. People were poor and interest rates were financially crippling. And the credit union offered a way out. It was a vehicle to improve lifestyle. And that first Canadian credit union was certainly small by today's modern standards of financial institutions. And in fact, I think the first deposit was something like 10 cents. And so once he collected all the dollars from folks that were interested, I think he raised all of $26. But, back in those days, Desjardins really did persevere. He devoted a great part of his life to the credit union development in North America as a whole, not just Canada. And he founded other credit unions. He founded the first one actually in the U.S. in 1909, and that was back in New Hampshire. Now, there were lots of others that were considered sort of the American fathers of credit unions, and Edward Filene is one of those. But I think, again, think about the era in the early 1900s and Filene himself was a very progressive thinker for his time. He began profit-sharing plans for his employees. He instituted very novel, absolutely novel fringe benefit programs. He was the founder of Bargain Basement, that whole idea in department store operation. But, I think more importantly, he allowed his employees to engage in collective bargaining and arbitration. He established minimum wages for female workers, okay? He advocated a 5-day, 40-hour week. And that was pretty significant in that era. There was also a contemporary of Filene, another fellow by the name of Pierre J. And
can you say those names a little bit slower because I'm not hearing them?
Sure. It was Edward Filene is the one I referred to as, I guess I would call him the American father of credit unions. He's the one that everyone's very much aware of in terms of starting our industry for very specific reasons here. But the other fellow was Pierre J. He was also instrumental in bringing credit unions to the U.S. He was a fan of what were called at the time People's Bank, but those things weren't legal at the time. So he wanted to find a way that we could make those things legal. So these guys all got together. So Desjardins from Canada and Filene and Jay all got together, and they worked on legislation, which actually became the first General State Credit Union Act in the United States, and that was in 1909.
Okay.
And that movement grew, trust me, pretty steadily, state by state, to the point where in 1934 was when President Roosevelt signed the Federal Credit Union Act into law. So it became a big deal, and it created a very national system to charter and, of course, to supervise federal credit unions. And the movement grew considerably, and it grew steadily in the 40s and the 50s. And by 1960, believe it or not, there were more than 6 million individuals that belonged to, I guess it was about 10,000 credit unions at that time. We, of course, set up the whole structure to go with that and had, share insurance and deposit insurance put into play. We created an independent government agency for it. I mean, it was all legitimized in a very big way. So, there was lots of changes that were brought about in the 70s in the kinds of products that were offered by financial institutions. But credit unions, too, found that they needed to expand their services. So in 1977, federal legislation allowed our credit unions to offer the new services to our members, and that included everything from, term deposits and share certificates to mortgages. So we became kind of mainstream. So when you say you wish you had known about it a lot earlier, it probably really started to get attention back in the 70s. But I think there's a nice connection between why these institutions were created and what women were going through during those formative years.
Well, back then in the 70s, I knew about credit unions, but I did not know they were cooperatives. Okay. People still don't know that credit unions are co-ops, and that's one of the reasons National Cooperative Bank is sponsoring this program. It's so they let people know about co-ops and what they can do. It's pooling together 10 cents till you can get $26 and you can make a loan or help people out. You said have a better quality of life, I think is what you said. Improve lifestyle is what you said.
Exactly. And I think you just telling me that people just don't know that we're structured as financial cooperatives, and it is a very significant alternative to what I guess mainstream banking would be today. So I think we should pause and maybe think about that or talk about that a bit, and that is the difference between credit unions and traditional banks, because I still think it's a big secret. And there's perhaps some myth attached to it too. And of course, the biggest difference is, as you pointed out, credit unions are not nonprofit financial cooperatives, and traditional banks that everyone's used to are for-profit businesses. So big difference right there. And as cooperatives, credit unions are owned by our members, so that's who owns us. In contrast, if you think about banks, they're owned by shareholders. So basically, we have members and they have customers, and that difference is actually, it affects everything we do. It's the lens on which we put everything that we do through. So because members are our owners, we're not just trying to sell them stuff. We're not just trying to squeeze profits out of them, right? We're trying to improve our members' financial lives, and we do that by offering all of the same products and services that working people need, but at a better value than traditional banks do. And unlike banks, a big part of our mission involves financial education, financial wellness. We work to educate our members about everything from whether it's budgeting or buying a home and reaching financial goals to investing and planning for retirement. And at the end of the day, we just structured to help our member owners. So as they have life financial problems, we're there to help them solve them at a much better price and more accessible in terms of just our approach to being helpful. So bottom line is, think about it. Banks are for profit and credit unions are for people. That's really the big difference.
Well, say that again. Say that again. Say that again.
Mm-hmm.
Banks are for profit?
The bottom line is that banks are for profit and credit unions are for people. And it's really two different business models. And the fact that you can collectively own your financial institution and those that make deposits help those that need money to borrow. And we can do that at rates that are certainly superior to the banks. Because remember what they're driven to do. They're driven to produce shareholder value. So, preferred stockholders are the winners in the bank structure, whereas members are the winners with a cooperative financial institution.
Teresa, I want to give a definition here for our audience. We talk about co-ops, but co-ops can be any business that you can think of. There's about four main types, but there's all kinds of different variations of these types. If the business is owned and controlled by the employees, then it's called a worker cooperative. If the employees own and control it, if the people that use the products or services own or control it, it is called a consumer cooperative. And credit unions are owned and controlled by the members that use the services, the people that make deposits, have the checking accounts. And housing co-ops, another example of consumer co-ops. There's also a co-op in Madison, Wisconsin, that is a clinic, a health clinic. It's owned and controlled by the patients. So it's patient-centric members as opposed to shareholders, those people that put up money to own it, are the doctor-centric. Here, a credit union is for the people, for the members. It's member-owned and controlled. And there are 7 principles that co-ops run by. The one that drew me to it is education, and we'll come back to that. We've got to take our first break, Teresa, with that definition. We'll be right back to talk more about the 100-year history of NCBA and cooperatives. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes with Everything Cooperative. And we have Teresa Freeborn with us today, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of Xceed Financial Credit. And when we left off, we were talking about the benefits of a credit union over another financial institution called banks. The banks are normally owned by what Teresa was telling, owned by shareholders, people that put money into the bank and they get shares of stock, and then they vote on the management. And more often than not, they are only interested in, or the majority interest is profit. They're concerned about their customers to the extent that they can get profit out of them. Where credit unions are owned by the people that, the members are the people who put their money in deposits in the credit union, they elect the board of directors whose focus is on the people. What's the best products for the people? What's the best education that we can get for the people? How can we get them to be financially educated and make smart decisions? Did I capture that okay, Teresa?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Nice summary.
Okay. And this started, you talked about 1909, a little bit more than 100 years ago. And by the way, Teresa, I had a lady, Harriet May, on the show 2 years ago, pretty much when we got started. Harriet May was the president of a billion-dollar credit union in El Paso, Texas, started off as a clerk and became the chief executive officer, female, a little short lady that is powerful. And she said if 5 men started that credit union with $5 each. So credit unions and other co-ops pool the resources, whatever money it is. People can put in pennies or dollars, and then by pooling that money, they have some power, some financial power, that when somebody needs something, they can come in and borrow it, and with the paying it back with a little bit of interest, not a lot of interest, compared to banks. They'll want more and more and more interest. And I like that you can do mortgages now.
That's interesting. I know Harriet May very well, and she's a very good friend of mine, and her story in the beginning of her credit union is very much like most of our stories, and very modest beginnings, as usually workers of a certain employer gathered their funds to create a credit union in those very early years. 50 to 80 years ago is the typical range of the age of credit unions these days. So we all had exactly that same beginning. I guess the difference was that it was at those times pretty much formed by men versus women. So now women are certainly taking a little more increasing role in the leadership of these credit unions throughout the country.
Who are some of the leaders, women leaders, that have influenced you that you say would be your heroes or sheroes?
Oh, there are so many, but it's funny. One of the ones that you had mentioned at the very start of the program when the introduction was going on about the first American woman in space back in 1983, and that would be Sally Ride. So certainly impressed with that. And of course, in my industry, given the financial services industry, Mickey Seabird, her name actually is Muriel Mickey Seabird, and what's significant about her is that, again, pretty gutsy woman. She was the first to buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and I think she paid about $500,000 back in 1967 for that. But before then, women were only permitted on the trading floor as clerks and pages, and they were brought in to fill the shortages back in World War II and the Korean War. So the motivation was very different. So to see a woman actually enter on her own right in 1967 was pretty phenomenal. And then, of course, I have a particular bone to pick with just the general running of our country, let alone my sector, in terms of women's involvement and participation, and was delighted when Shirley Chisholm in 1968 was the first African-American woman elected to Congress and tried in terms of making a bid to the Democrat Party's candidate for president in 1972. But, again, that was a pretty gutsy move. And if you look today, Vernon, I mean, unfortunately, although women make up 50% of the population in the country, in fact, just a little bit more than 50%, you know, if you look at our congressional representatives, less than 20% are women. You look at the Senate, less than 20% are women. Keep going and look at the Supreme Court. I mean, it's just the way the world is sort of run is just not in sort of direct relation to the number of very capable women that could stand up and take some of these posts. So we've got a ways to go still.
You know, Jessica Gordon Nimhard, and that's who I was talking about in the beginning, wrote a book called Collective Courage. In her book, one of the things that she pointed out was in the African-American experience with co-ops, and there's a great history, which she's gone through and collected a lot of it, that a lot of the people that push the cooperative movement in the African-American experience was women, that women were very much involved in. And I've asked on this program, I'm asked you, why are women so much involved in the cooperative movement? Do you have a sense of that?
I do, and perhaps it's more in my industry. So I'm going to talk about financial cooperatives because I know that very well. Mm-hmm. But I think it has a lot to do with the values that cooperatives represent. And cooperative principles are about empowering the powerless, you know, and lifting those up who are struggling with societal and economic inequalities. And I think my career provides a pretty good example of this is that, you know, early on, I wanted to be in charge, but there weren't a lot of role models for women who aspired into the C-suite back then, the chief suite of a corporation. And the Old Boys Network was pretty much in its heyday, and they were certainly helping, you know, promising young men along with their careers. But for the most part, women were kind of, you know, at arm's length. But let's be honest, you know, few of us, whether you're male or female, we don't just pop out of the womb with skills for negotiating and presenting and networking and other key markers for leadership. I know I didn't, and I had to learn those things. And you know, throughout my career, I benefited tremendously from mentoring and support from some very smart credit union leaders. And, of course, all of them were men as I was beginning and as they were for Harriet. And a lot of the African-American women that also started out, they had men mentors, and they had to. And because there weren't many women leaders back then, so there was no one for us to be mentored by in terms of a female. And I know for me, I'm very indebted to those what I call gender blind men. And, you know, they upended that Old Boys Network. They really did. And they thought that women like me could amount to something in business. So again, I credit their cooperative values, but it goes along with some human decency and some fair-mindedness as well. And I just think that this whole cooperative movement provides a very fertile ground for women to get involved with business in this model. It's just our principles. It's just how we're structured. It's more accessible. But I also want to caution us that I know in my business, in my industry, there are probably more women. It's something like about 75% of financial institutions that are cooperative, financial cooperatives, are run by women.
75%.
But there's a reason for that.
Okay.
And I would say it's because they're so small. The institutions are so small, and men just aren't interested in those small institutions. Okay, so we get a little bit of a leg up there, but where you start to see our involvement diminishing is as the institutions get bigger. They're still primarily the domain of men. And I know for one thing, I just looked at some research, and for credit unions, for instance, that are over $1 billion, we are, Harriet's credit unions obviously over $1 billion, all of these institutions that are sort of substantial and getting larger every day, it's 14% are run by women. And it's getting less. It's not progressing and getting better. It's actually getting worse as those institutions get bigger. So it's a great place to start because you have opportunities that men, quite frankly, don't want. So you can get involved with a small institution, but know full well that there still is a bit of a glass ceiling there. It's not really saying let's champion women at the very senior levels of the larger financial cooperatives. So we've still got some work to do there.
Judy Zigwak, who is now the president and executive director of the National Cooperative Business Association, was on, and I asked her the question, and she said it was more like that women, by their nature, at least this is what I took from the conversation. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but women by their very nature are more cooperative, nurturing, and so it's sort of the cooperative movement fits, particularly the values that you talked about earlier, with women's very, very, very nature. Now, have you had an opportunity to look at Michael Moore's new movie, Where to Invade Next?
No.
You need to look at it because, I knew nothing about it. I went to look at it. There were only maybe 10 people in the movie theater, but he had a section about women. And in the Arctic, I think it is, in 2008, the only bank that did not fail or go under or have hard times was a bank that was started and run by women. And it was that they didn't take the big risks that men take. They don't get out on the limb. And so when he was interviewing 3 chief executive officers, one of them said women solve problems with words, not fists, not guns. So I thought that was quite interesting. And they don't have to try to figure out who's more manly. Okay. Yeah, so I find it very, very interesting. And maybe that's why what Jessica found out in the African-American experience is that the cooperative movement was fueled by more women. And I was also thinking it might be because men were out fighting wars, but that may be the case and may not be the case.
Well, I totally agree with you, Vernon. And, if you think of sort of what men are expected to be, they're expected to be confident and opinionated and assertive, and women are expected to be nurturing and compassionate and passive. So women just aren't top of mind when it comes to what you think of when you think about a leadership. So we call that the second generational bias. And I think by and large, it's still alive. People do think about this. It's unintentional. I don't think people are going through, selection of CEOs saying, I'm not consciously not selecting a woman. I think it's just top of mind leadership is always, you think, men. Okay. And I'm going to go back to when I started in the industry in the 70s, and I worked with no one but women, except my bosses. They were all men. And the only other exception was the men that were being groomed to be managers. But the rest it's called the pink ghetto. It's all women. And so it was a bit of a sea change there in sort of the late 70s where men would start to appreciate what women were bringing to the table, and why wouldn't we make room for them at that senior level? So, but it's interesting. There's a bit of a hangover there, and I think it's going to be some time, and perhaps when my 33-year-old daughter is, in her 40s, the number of leaders will be sort of more on that 50-50 level. I'm not sure, but it's truly, it's this bias that we have, and it's unfortunate, but it's real. It's real.
Well, I'm African American, and through my life, I've looked at what I call systemic discrimination. And that's what you're talking about with women, too. We face that with glass ceilings all the time, that it's sort of just expected that who is going to lead is white man. And so everything is focused with white men, particularly when they start looking at the career path upward to the president or to the chairman of the board. It's normally a handful or a dozen of white men and not African Americans and not female. So yeah, I've experienced the same kind of thing in my world.
Exactly. So there's probably a couple of things that come to play there, and one is, first of all, are women, or in your particular case, Black men, are they viewed as sort of having all of the leadership qualities that are required? And the reason why someone may not say yes is because they don't see them in those roles, and there are no examples. I mean, the role models are few and far between. So that's the first step, right, we need to get, some diversity at that top level so that people can, and young people coming in can look and say, see, it's possible. I can be everything I want to be. They're taught that, but then when they get into a corporate world, they see that that's not what's really going on. So it's a big deal. And and the other piece that I think of when as you're speaking is that, there's no suggestion that women need to become more like men to be successful here. I think what has to be proven here is that, women that own and exercise would have long been regarded as their leadership liabilities, which is that sensitivity and perceptiveness and connectedness and compassion. All those leadership attributes, you combine those with the strengths of men, and I know we're going to improve the outcomes of business decisions. We're going to make better decisions in those boardrooms. So when you talk about, those businesses that run better with, how about a 50-50? How about just a really good, equitable distribution of talent and not just, white males running everything? There is so much value in bringing all these perspectives to the table to make a decision. That's why those companies are more profitable, and that's why they run better.
One of the main strengths of America is the diversity that we have here. It's just how do we capture it and use it to the benefit of American corporates and so forth. But back to this Michael Moore movie, they said in the Arctic, the law was passed that you had to have 40% or more women on all boards. And you had to have 40% of men on all boards. And you could not have 60% or more of either. So you had to have between 40 and 60% of men and 40 and 60% of women, and maybe we need something like that in the U.S. And perhaps we can even get more genius going if we talked about how many Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian. If we got the whole mix going by law, that would be very, very interesting to the decisions.
Well, but it takes a leader to be aware of that, and it takes a lot of courage for some folks to stand up. So I look at my industry and I think, okay, well, look at my credit union. So what are we doing to further advance women? I can be the CEO here, but what am I doing to ensure, that we're going to continue to do that? I mean, that's the real question. And I think every institution needs to ask themselves that question and ask it in their boardroom, and that includes board composition. I'm delighted to tell you that 5 out of our 9 board members are women. Including our board vice chair, who happens to be African American. Our 5-person executive management team includes 3 women, including me. We have a chief marketing officer, African American, and our chief risk officer is Hispanic. And our management team is strongly female, and it's diverse. And it's, we've got 26% African American, 18% Hispanic, and I think it's like close to 15% now Asian. It's 40% white. And I'm going to tell you that I consciously have to be aware of that as a leader. And I think there's the first problem is that I don't know if every leader out there is truly aware of, first of all, what are those numbers? Can anybody else rattle those off? I suspect not. People don't think of it. But if you start to think of it, you get a little embarrassed that you haven't actually, come up with that kind of distribution. And I'm just saying that you've got to start counting. You got to know where you stand with your gender balance, and you got to know where you stand with your ethnicity balance. You really do. And if you get that balance right, that's when you're going to make better decisions. There's just no question.
And that's the reason for it. You make better decisions for your customers. You make better decisions for your company, and therefore you have a much more successful and stronger company, providing the services that you're there to do. I mean, it just makes all this sort of common sense, but a lot of people don't look at it. And when we start talking about leadership, we could spend the next 2 hours talking about this political presidential election and the different kinds of leaders that could come out of that. But I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there.
No, I know. Neither am I. I would love to, but no, not today. But it's interesting because you mentioned sort of almost what I guess we called it in the 60s was the affirmative action programs. And is it time, because a lot of countries have mandated that they must increase their board composition to women and other ethnicities by a certain time period? And we're talking, having 40% women, having 40%, at that board table, the very senior board table. Can you imagine what happens then if you get to a place where you have gender balance, and then that board starts making decisions on the very senior people that will run the organization, as in the CEO? You've got more women at the table that are thinking about that. So the chances are pretty good you're going to think about a woman leader a little more often. And again, I look at my industry.
We'll take our second break.
I sit on a lot of...
Teresa, I'm sorry, but we have to take our second break. So I'd ask everybody to don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, Everything Cooperative. National Cooperative Bank is sponsoring this program. NCB's mission is to help cooperatives grow by supporting and being an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members, placing special emphasis on serving the needs of communities that are economically challenged. Communities that are economically challenged, which brings also to mind Flint, Michigan, and other communities. Teresa, what would it be like to start a worker co-op, a food co-op in Flint, Michigan? They say they don't have a food store, or I don't know if they have a credit union in Flint, but get a group of people together to create a credit union so that the poor people there can have resources to do the things that they need, whether it's buying a car or a computer or down payment in a co-op, a housing co-op. So there's all kinds of ways that this co-op can help poor communities, and National Co-op Bank that's their charter, that's their mission, that's what they do. Mm-hmm. Have you worked with the NCB at all in your bank? Have you had services there?
No, I have not. But your comment about Flint, I guarantee you there's a credit union there.
Okay.
So there's absolutely opportunities for that kind of assistance and involvement and participation in that community.
Well, I did have a question from Herb Fisher out of the National Association of Housing Co-ops. He wanted to know if we could get more, like I think it's the sixth principle, cooperation among cooperatives between credit unions and housing co-ops, particularly affordable housing co-ops. Sometimes there's a $2,000 membership fee, $5,000, $10,000 membership fee to go into a housing co-op. And then maybe the credit unions could loan that money to potential owner of a housing co-op. Have you ever looked at different ways of working cooperatively with either housing co-ops or food co-ops or other co-ops?
Yes, we do provide exactly that kind of lending to those that are requesting it. So we do have all sorts of lending programs that do speak very much to exactly what you're describing there.
Now,
that certainly is available. You'll find that most credit unions do.
Where is Xceed?
We are located in El Segundo, California, is where our headquarters is. But we have our operations are actually brick and mortar, as in branches, in 6 states. But we operate in 43 states in total now. So we actually, because of our remote nature, we have the ability to service any potential members throughout the country.
So you have brick and mortar in 6 states, and you operate, I guess, computer-wise in 43 states?
Yes. In other words, we can operate in every state. There's nothing restricting us from doing that. We were born out of a workplace credit union, as most credit unions are. Okay, they start with a company wanting to provide a benefit to their employees. And so ours came out of the tech industry. We were first started up as Scientific Data Systems out of El Segundo, California. And when Xerox Corporation bought Scientific Data Systems, Xerox didn't have a credit union. So we became Xerox's credit union. That's where the X comes from in our name. So then we brought in other workplaces that needed a credit union in various areas. And we now have over 300 workplaces that use our credit union. And there's always a way to find a way for everyone to join our credit union. There are many associations that you're going to find that you're members of, perhaps cooperatives, for instance. And if you're a member of that cooperative, you can also join our credit union. So there are many ways for you to take advantage of a membership in Xceed, as well as any other credit union out there. There's over 6,000 credit unions in the country. And we're very much predisposed to working with other cooperatives.
So Xceed, that's Xceed. So what's your webpage? How would people find out about you if they said
.org.
.org.
Yeah, Xceed.org.
One more time.
And if you're looking for a credit, okay, Xceed.org.
Okay.
And you can also go to find a creditunion.org, and you can look for a credit union in a specific town that you happen to live in, and that helps you locate one as well. There's a big location engine that exists that we all make sure that we're involved in, so that there really no reason. Everyone can join a credit union. There's a credit union for everyone in the country. And it's interesting because I guess I spend most of my time when I'm out in a social setting, because people say, well, what do you do for a living? So then I can talk about how I'm a CEO of a credit union, which is a financial cooperative, and I talk about the very basic structure of this credit union and my industry. And without hesitation, everyone always says, I didn't know I could have any of that. I didn't know I could participate in a credit union. And once we start talking about our rates are better, our fees are better, our personal approach is better, it's done. I mean, all I can think of is that it's very close. It's an altruistic model here. I mean, I've always said to people, I feel I do noble work. It's noble. It's not about squeezing, profit out of every one of the members that we're working with. And it's about doing right by the member. It's about making sure that our members get the absolute best possible advice, even if the advice is to have to go down the street and get a better deal on something we can't do. And that's just how we look at it. It's not just for members. It's about educating the public and giving them tools that they need to solve their financial problems. So it's just a very different view. And once I start talking to people about this kind of structure, they go looking for a credit union. I mean, because it's just like you just need to be told about that, and you can see the difference. It's palpable.
Can you go back through, we're on an elevator or we're at a party, we got a drink in our hands, and you say you work for a credit union. What do you tell me the benefits of being in a credit union? What are the benefits?
Well, first of all, I try and get a feel for the demographic or the psychographic of the individual I'm talking to. So, for instance, if I was in a room of millennials, the young guys, and a lot of them have just followed their parents' direction in terms of banking. So they would, if their parent banked at Chase, they're banking at Chase. But quite frankly, they don't want to sort of follow the man, if you know what I mean, right? They're kind of anti-establishment. So we represent that in a modern way, if you think about it. We represent, don't get sucked into all that big corporate stuff and become a number, basically is what you're going to be at Chase. But instead, why don't you come to your credit union, and here's what we can do. And the whole point is you're helping other people. They like to hear that. They like to hear that that's how a cooperative is structured. They like the idea of cooperatives. It's an easy sell to that group, but they don't know that they can access it. So in my elevator speech to that group, it would be more along the lines of, do you want to participate in your financial institution? I mean, how cool is that? And more credit unions are reaching out and looking for younger people to be on their boards to represent that group, because that is tomorrow's group. we need to structure products and services that meet the needs of that group. So they like it. They're pretty much predisposed to it, just given, their very nature. So that's how I would do it with that group. Now, at the same time, I'm going to go complete opposite and say, we actually provide a private banking service to corporate heads. So the large companies that we deal with, we will provide a suite of products and services that help them navigate their finances. And guess what? They're not much different than yours and mine. Okay, they just make a lot more money. So it's just a different, amount of money that we're dealing with. But their services are still the same. Their products are still the same. And quite frankly, I think that the big banks have sort of built this into some sort of, a private banking, as in, for the very, very affluent. And what it really means, if you cut through it all, is they're paying a lot more fees than you and I are paying. Let's put it that way. And they may get someone phoning them every now and then, but quite frankly, the value is not there. And once they hear what we have to offer, and once they see the kind of dollars that they can save, even as a very well-paid person, they're in. And we have no problem converting them. But it's about getting that word out. So I just think we talk in terms of value. We talk in terms of just how we approach consumers and how we're really interested in your interests. What are your interests?
How do you approach customers? I come in, Teresa, and I want to go get a car. And do you have somebody sit down and I fill out the application? They talk to me. Is it totally on credit score that you're going to do it, or do you sort of try to figure out what kind of person I am? How do you do this?
Yeah, well, we do have that sort of traditional approach, and more people are wanting to do things online. So we certainly have that available. So what we did is we did a little bit of a hybrid, for our institution. And we have what's called the Member Experience Centers. So what we allow our members to do is they basically can FaceTime us. They can do it on their smartphone or on their iPad, and they can have a face-to-face chat with one of our associates here. And we do start with, what are your dreams? Like, what are you looking to do? Okay, we start with all of that for sure. But, people don't like to approach anyone and talk about their finances. Usually they're embarrassed. They're not more ahead than they should be at this point in their lives. So you got to sort of disarm that. You've got to get them feeling comfortable. And I think that's what we're really good at, is allowing people to kind of let their hair down. And really, we can really help them better if they really come clean with us and tell us, what they want to do and where they think they're stuck and how can we help. We have a loan for everyone is kind of our philosophy. We don't say no. We just figure out how can we help these people. And it could be simply improving their cash flow, because that's usually the most obvious that we find is that people do have car loans somewhere else. And once we take a hard look at what they're paying, we know we can do better for them. So can you imagine if we can free up an extra $100, $200 a month for someone? It's big. It's major. And what if they could put that $100 or $200 a month toward a credit card bill that they've been unable to pay down? Or what if they could just save it? How can we help them do that? But it's kind of a holistic look. We don't like to just sort of fill an order. To us, that doesn't help anyone. We've had some of our corporations go through furloughs, where, in the recession, there were some tough times. And people were cut back, and people were told, well, you're going to take a mandatory 2-week vacation without pay. I don't know about you, but I couldn't suffer no paycheck for a 2-week period. It would be hard. And so what we did is we just swoop right in and say, look, we're going to look after that for you. We're going to give you a really good deal on what your 2-week paycheck would be. We're going to make a loan to you. But more importantly, can we look at everything else for you? Can we see if we can actually structure things differently to help you in your financial life? The number one stressor in a workplace is financial. And you might think in some organizations that it would be, I don't know, something to do with the work. It has nothing to do with the work. People are stressed out financially, and they need someone to talk to. So that's kind of that's our specialty, is to be able to find out what's really wrong and how do we come up with some solutions for you.
So you just said what I say on this program. Co-ops are formed to solve community problems. That's why a lot of credit unions were formed. They normally provide a better product, and that is, in this case, your product are loans and education. but you provide a product that somebody needs. You try to sit them down and work with them and train them, that you focus on them and what's best for them. And you normally do it at a lower price, as competitive or lower price, so that your interest rates would be lower because you don't have profit in there. And so without the profit by itself, without having to have this huge profit, you can have a lower price. But also, if you're managed better, making better decisions, less risky kinds of decisions, so you don't have as much. Can you tell me what your default rate is and how that compares to the banks?
Yes. In the credit, let's just take even one category. Let's talk about credit card realm. Ours is like 20% of the delinquency rate of any of the big banks. It's significantly less. So we actually put so much into that relationship with our member that we have members that go bankrupt and come back and pay us back later because they feel this commitment to the cooperative structure of the organization. It's phenomenal.
So you can have a lower interest because you have less defaults, and you don't have, that's what I was getting to, you don't have this huge profit that you must make. So you can provide a lower interest on a mortgage or on a car loan or interest or a consolidation loan to get their cash flow working better. So you try to structure something. You have a loan for everybody. I like that motto. I love that motto. A loan for everybody. Just trying to figure out and working with them to figure out what is the best loan.
Exactly. And you know what? You may start off with a higher rate because we have to risk rate these loans. We can't give, the pristine FICO score the same rate as, say, someone who's really struggling because the risk is higher, and it's not fair to our members to simply, be too, wanton in our decision making there. But what it comes with is today, this is your rate. Come back and let's take a look at this in a year and let's see how you're doing. And you're making those payments on time. Guess what happens? Your credit score is just improved. And because of that, we can rewrite that loan now at a much better rate. I mean, we're interested in moving these people forward. If at the end of the day we can show some progress there in terms of helping people get on the right track. Lots of young people mess up their credit at a very early age. And, our goal is to get them back on track mainstream so they too can buy a house one day. So it's that kind of thing.
So do you find you have more women clients?
Yes, we do. And in fact, and I wish I had those stats with me right off the top here, but we do have more women members. And we also find that women are the primary decision maker in a household, more so than ever before. Mm-hmm. We have more working women than ever before at substantial breadwinners and equal to their spouse or their partner. So, yeah, the world's changed that way for sure. And women, I think, are more, first of all, they find the whole financial services industry quite confusing. And it's because I think it was built for men by men, okay? And the products and services are described that way, and they're intimidating. They're terribly intimidating. So we're trying to take the mystery out of all that because it really isn't that difficult to understand. It's just the way it's been presented. It's kind of a mystery. So we're trying to make that a little more simple for all of our members, but directed mostly at the women side as well.
Teresa, what's the last word you have to say? Well, we got 2 more minutes. So what would you like for our members, our listeners to know about co-ops, about Women's Month, about our history, and what we can look forward to the future?
Well, because I've spent quite a bit of my last couple of years talking about advancing women in leadership in my industry, I can't affect the world, and I certainly can't affect government structure, but I can certainly make some noise about my industry and advancing women in leadership. And I would say that, it's time to see a significant increase of women in power in cooperatives in general. And I'd say that, first things first, let's start counting. Let's start really acknowledging how far and what progress we've made in that realm to get sort of that gender balance in the workplace at the senior level. It's easy to do, and it makes such good sense. So that's really the point that I'd like to leave everyone. If you think everything's okay, go do some counting.
Okay.
I suspect you'll find that it's not.
Well, I would just add, from Michael Moore's point of view, you get better decisions with women in control. Have a great day, everybody. Have a great week. Teresa, thank you so very much for being on and for all of this great information. Banks are for profit. Credit unions are for the people. Bye now.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye.